You're listening to Truflation Spaces special edition featuring economist, investor, and author Lyn Alden. This episode, of course, is always sponsored by Truflation Premium, our granular look from millions of data points at economic trends. Institutions, businesses, investors need to stay ahead, and really part of that involves basically weaning off of government data, which is stale and lagging. Truflation exists as an immutable, censorship-resistant source of financial information that is timely, relevant, and accurate. So surf over to truflation.com and click the black download data button and choose the plan right for you. And let's see, vamping a little bit to make sure we get all of our guests in and start the episode proper here. We're almost there. Again, our guest today is Lyn Alden, and it's a special episode. So we're going to focus mostly on her book, but also kind of get her background and philosophy and all of that good stuff. So it looks like I've got most of the speakers in here. Before we start the formal episode, it's always good to check in with our CEO, Stefan Roost, and get the state of the Truflation Nation, basically where we're at and what we're doing. But Stefan, you've been globetrotting, man. You've been all over the place the last couple of weeks. Are you kind of back at home base now, or what is the state of the Truflation Nation?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and nice to have such great guests on the show again. Yeah, it's been a wild week. I think everybody's back and trying to do revenge business, and yeah, so it was a lot going on in Singapore. There was the Token 2049, which was a crypto event. Then we had the Milken Institute Summit that was there simultaneously, wrapped around a Formula One event. And then New York was pretty busy with Real World Asset Summit. You had the Messari event, and then you had the UNGA as well at the same time, the General Assembly for the UN. And so that was creating havoc. But it was amazing to me how a city like New York could easily digest 200,000 visitors, really with no problem whatsoever. So it was not really a challenge for that city. And then, yeah, and now it's in Europe a bit, sort of around London and Barcelona. We work very closely with Chainlink as an Oracle service for bringing our data to on-chain and sort of writing that on the chain so it becomes immutable and we can't go back and change it. And it's also permissionless, so anybody can supply data and provide data into the ecosystem, but everybody can always be able to read the true source of inflation. And so, yeah, exciting times, really busy, and crazy. But yeah, it's also really good to talk about the title, broken money. When you travel the world, I shouldn't laugh because it's a very sad matter. The amount of debt that is accumulating worldwide, we saw a huge spike to some $300 trillion now worldwide, largely driven by Western nations like Japan, the US, the UK, and France, sort of really spending beyond their means and continuing to spend beyond their means. And we're getting to a point with interest rates going up to a point where 50% of the tax income is going to be used just to service that debt, not to to pay it off, but to service it in terms of interest payments. So the world's at a very interesting juncture. And, I think the reason why we're all here is we love this thing called Bitcoin, that is a sort of a neutral money. It's set in its ways and it's governed by multiple different parties. So exciting times and really keen to learn more about how our money is broken and how we need a new financial system, which we've been talking about for a while.
Yeah, very nice. We also have the Truflation team here as well. That's Ivan Yelich, head of data, and Oliver Rust, head of product. And we're honored to have back on the panel Omar Yahya of Matter Labs and ZK Sync. Economist, investor, and author Lyn Alden began her professional life, believe it or not, as an electrical engineer in the aviation industry, retiring at the age of 33. And since then, she's become a highly sought after financial analyst and investment advisor, leading the Lyn Alden investment strategy. And her work can be found at lynalden.com, lynalden.com. She's also, as Stefan alluded to, the author of the new book, Broken Money, Why Our Financial System is Failing Us and How We Can Make It Better. It's available in hardcover, softcover, and digital formats. And I'm going to ask her if there's going to be an audio book as well, because we, believe it or not, as we were promoting this episode, that's a question that kept coming up. So I'll ask her about that as well. But first, Lyn Alden, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited. And when I told the staff, Truflation staff, you were coming on, at least two were in the middle of reading your book. So that's a new one on us. So you have fans in our audience. And maybe a good first question to get us jumping off, which, again, our CEO kind of alluded to here, is your thesis, which is that you assert money is broken, but it seems to work pretty well here in the United States, right? So what's broken about it?
I think it's broken in both subtle ways and obvious ways. And as you point out, it really depends on the country that you talk about. Basically, in the developing world, it's more obviously broken. Whereas if you're in the developed world, some of the aspects that it has as shortcomings are less obvious. So if you go to the developing world, you're generally going to run into very high levels of inflation on a regular basis. A surprisingly high number of currencies have outright hyperinflated, like since like the 1980s, let alone over the past century. And it's very hard for people to save liquid capital when the unit of account is constantly debasing, their savings are constantly debasing. They're often forced to invest heavily in extra real estate, for example, and other types of malinvestment, just as for something to hold on to that's more tangible. If we look at the developed world, it's the same essential type of problem, but it's just slowed down considerably. So basically, you have a constant grind of inflation. You have a constant debt accumulation, and these things are issues that they're always in the background, and then every some number of decades they kind of come out and manifest all at once. So you had really big financial implosions in the 1930s. You had it again in the early 1970s. We had it again ever since the 2008 financial crisis, and then again during the COVID response. And these things are basically wealth transfers. They're dilutive, wealth transfers. And one thing I kind of focused on in the book is that it's not just a set of policy decisions that makes money broken. It's that the technology itself has been a limiting factor. Maybe we can get into that.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask as well. I kind of follow your profile here. You're in Egypt recently, right? So I mean, obviously you could. I mean, you can live your book's thesis, and I can't imagine what the Egyptians are going through relative to what you just said. It must be a horrible time to try to invest and save and all that stuff relative to, say, something like the U.S., right?
Yeah, I think, and I go there every year because I have friends and family there, and so kind of living part of the year in the U.S. and a minority part of the year in Egypt gives two different perspectives. And so in there, you see a more directly broken monetary system, although it's not as problematic as some countries. But basically, what they recently went through was a devaluation of their currency relative to the dollar. So for context, back in 2016, they did a sharp, practically overnight devaluation. They basically cut the Egyptian pound in half relative to the dollar. And then they just did it again, this time in 3 stepwise bursts over, say, a 12-plus month period. They're probably going to do a fourth one. And both of those devaluations were at the behest of the IMF. Basically, Egypt has accumulated a lot of foreign debt. Much of it is dollar denominated, which means they can't print it. So it's actually, they risk default should they be unable to roll that debt over and refinance it. And so when they kind of run into these debt headwinds, they have to go to the IMF, and the IMF is happy to give out debt to help that refinance and help kind of keep the wheels on the cart. but they usually give certain terms that a country has to do in order to receive those loans, and one of them is a currency devaluation. And so Egypt had this big stepwise currency devaluation, and in addition, everybody kind of knows it hurts the savings. I mean, basically, in Egypt and many developing countries, not a lot of people own equities. Usually the equities are not as reliable as the S&P 500. So instead, they own cash, they own real estate, and that's kind of their main asset holdings usually. And so in this case, everyone's liquid savings were sharply devalued. But I think the part that goes underreported is that their ongoing income was also devalued. So, any Egyptian that was not able to negotiate a 100% raise in local currency terms has been devalued in terms of their global purchasing power, not just their savings, but their ongoing wages. So you have some people trying to recoup losses with like a 10% raise or a 20% raise if they can get anything at all. But of course, what the big impact is that that's not nearly enough to compensate them for the devaluation that occurred. So they're getting paid fewer dollar equivalents per hour or per day or whatever their time frame is than they were, say, 2 years ago. And that was basically a centralized decision that was out of their control. So it's not just savings, it's also the unit of account that's a big deal. And we see that in the US as well. Basically, if inflation is 3% per year on average, every worker has basically the burden put on them to try to get a 3% raise or higher just to keep up with inflation. And if they go to their employer and they say, hey, I'd like a 5% raise, the employer is often going to say, well, why are you 5% better than last year? And of course, the answer that the employee is trying to do is say, well, I'm not 5% better, I'm like 2% better. And the other 3% is just for inflation, it's just treading water. And that's a challenge that basically when the unit of account is constantly devaluing, it puts a lot of effort on people to keep up their income. And we see that more obviously in developing countries.
Yeah, I'm definitely asking for a raise after this, and I'm going to clip your thing so Stefan has to give me more money. The first question I think from the panel should come from our honored guest here as well, which is Omar Yahya of Matter Labs and ZK Sync. Omar, you're up for Lyn Alden.
Thank you. Hi, Lyn. Your newsletter is fantastic. I wanted to comment on the really nice framework that you have in the book for money as a technology. And a question or something that really continues to bother me is it's a very curious technology in the sense that if you go to one part of the world where everybody's running their machines on, a Windows 2000 OS, and then you go to the US and you see everybody's running the most recent version of the Mac OS, it's very clear why the differential in productivity is there and why one technological system is better, and it's just a matter of getting there. Whereas in the case of money, even though it's very clear that something is wrong, it's not clear which direction one should upgrade the technology to. So maybe you comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And the market over time helps us determine that. Basically, winning answers get kind of constantly rewarded, and losing answers basically get discovered as flawed in some way and discarded after a period of time. And the way that I generally describe the aspect of why money's broken now, like what technological limitation is causing it, is the very large gap in speed between transactions and settlements. And so, we can kind of define the modern era as post the invention of and deployment of the telegraph. So the telegraph was invented in the earlier 1800s, but it really wasn't deployed until the mid and later 1800s. And it was only in the kind of the later half that it really started to go across oceans and really connect us all in terms of fast communication. So before then, information could not move faster than the speed of humans. We can go on ships, we can go on horses, and that's about as fast as we can transmit information outside of very specific contexts like fire signals or something. Basically, it's very costly to have any sort of faster than human transmission of data, which means transactions themselves were also limited in terms of how quickly they could go over long distances. And with the invention of the telegraph and the deployment of it, and then eventually other, obviously, digital technologies, you go the phone, the internet, and you kind of scale up from there. But basically, all of those allow transactions to occur globally at roughly the speed of light, while at the time gold is money, and that still was moving and being verified at the speed of matter. And so that was kind of the birth of a much larger credit-based system. It really kind of accelerated the concentration, the centralization of banks, and it gave central banks in particular a lot of power because they essentially had a monopoly over long distance transfers. They basically ran the ledgers that were ostensibly linked to gold, and basically it required all this abstraction which government, central banks, and the banks themselves could do, and uniquely were kind of allowed to do. And so we've kind of been stuck in this local maximum where, for like a century and a half, where it's obviously good that transactions can happen so quickly, but because all of that has to be abstracted and credit-based for a period of time, it's, allowed these kind of, as what I describe it, as 160 different fiat currencies to exist. They're each these little local bubbles. The United States is the biggest one. That's the one that kind of ties them all together. And you have a couple other really big ones like the euro or the yuan. But for the most part, you have this long tail of currencies, and each one is basically has no acceptance outside of its jurisdiction, but they're mandated to be used in their jurisdiction, and they're allowed to get by. Like the reason they don't just kind of collapse overnight usually is because there's not really been a better alternative. And so what I find interesting about the invention of Bitcoin, and it's still being tested by the market and kind of scrutinized to see how it's going to do, but it's the first kind of credible invention of instant settlement, or at least near instant settlement. Instead of the long process of transporting and verifying gold and all the expense associated with that, a Bitcoin transaction can be settled in half an hour or 1 hour, depending on how many blocks you want to confirm it under. And so I think that's kind of like a rapid upgrade that starts to kind of chip away, or at least provide an alternative to kind of this broken monetary system. But then, of course, it's being tested to see, okay, what soft forks might be useful for it, what layers might be useful for it. Obviously, there's other cryptocurrencies out there that try to compete with it or do something that Bitcoin doesn't do. And so that's kind of what the market's testing out right now.
You're listening to Truflation Spaces, special edition with economist and author Lyn Alden. Her book, Broken Money, Why Our Financial System is Failing Us and How We Can Make It Better, is available right now in at least 3 different formats, hardcover, soft, and digital. And it's a brick of a book. It's huge, and it goes through just about everything you'd ever want to know about money. And it continues to just eat up all the financial world in terms of accolades and praise, and it is well worth seeking out. Just go get it. If you can't remember the entire title here, because I keep reading the subtitle, just Broken Money by Lyn Alden. We also want your questions and comments, so do request. We'll get you in here, and you get a chance to ask Lyn your financial questions or make a comment. It's up to you. A big fan of yours, who was super excited that I got you to come on, is our head of data, Ivan Yelich. So it's only proper before I hand it over to public comments here to get Ivan in here. Hey, Ivan, what's your question or comment for Lyn?
Well, first of all, great to be here, and I agree, great guests. And honestly, when we started with Truflation in the beginnings, I had a lengthy chat with one of my friends, and he just told me Lyn Alden has to say about inflation and what are her views on it. So that's what I did, and it was extremely helpful. So it's being in that regard, I've seen and I read that you kind of differentiate 3 types of inflation, focus on the consumer price inflation, and I've seen some comments on how calculated by the BLS. So maybe some comments, you see how they do. It's done good, could improve, and potentially where does Truflation stand in it?
You broke up a little bit, Ivan, but I think his question had to do with your views, Lyn, on inflation and how it's either calculated, tabulated. I know you wrote recently about the Fed hiking interest rates and whether that will tame inflation. But just your general thoughts on inflation. Sort of the classical theory, of course, is money printing. There's your answer. But I think you're a little bit more nuanced than that. I'm sorry, Ivan. Did I get the tenor of your question?
Well, it was more on the point on how it's been calculated by the BLS at this point.
Okay.
Some good things that are done and some that are not so good, and maybe in that light, how does and where does Lyn see truflation, if anywhere?
Sure, I'll hop in. I think the difficulty or different ways of defining or measuring inflation is one of the key reasons why it's so dangerous to people, is because they don't necessarily have the most accurate information on which to make decisions regarding holding money in something. And so you'll see some people say, well, inflation is the money supply, the expansion of the money supply, and other people will say, that the modern way we use the term inflation is generally referred to a basket of goods. Is that kind of being higher priced or lower priced over time, and at what pace? And so one of the things I kind of differentiate when talking about inflation is the three main types you mentioned, which is basically money supply growth, which is the source of most inflation. Then you have asset price inflation. So you have basically people competing and offering higher prices for things that we don't normally consider consumables, that are more like equities or more like stocks, things like that. So a lot of the value is kind of accruing in there. And then you have consumer price inflation, which either the CPI or you guys at Truflation find different ways to measure, kind of quantify what that is. And one way that I think about it and describe it in the book is that obviously set to its own devices, productivity is deflationary. So things should generally get cheaper over time. Not everything quickly, but some things quickly, right? So for example, the cost of taking a photograph has collapsed massively as we've made them digital, and then we even got rid of like the specialized device, so we can just, our general purpose phone can take photos, or they're very cheap to store. That's an example of technologically and productivity driven deflation. And so what central banks do is that they don't really want deflation to happen, so they try to offset that productivity increase that would result in lower prices with basically allowing for quick expansion of the money supply to try to offset that. And so instead of having, say, negative 2% inflation per year on average, they want to try to get us up to their target of 2%. And so when we look at, say, a money supply growth rate, in the developed world, it might be, say, 7% over a multi-decade period of time. So it means on average, every year, money supply is growing at about 7%. There will be periods like 2020 where it grows faster. And developing countries usually have a much faster growth rate as well, usually double digits. And then often they run into periods of hyperinflation where they might get out of control. But on average, in a developed world, you're looking at 7% or so supply inflation of the money. And then you start kind of categorizing different items and see how quickly they go up in price over a long period of time, and it generally comes down to their scarcity or energy intensity, right? So you'll see, for example, fine art or oceanfront property generally goes up roughly in line with the money supply growth over long stretches of time, because that's a relatively fixed amount of supply that more money chases. Then when you go down to slightly less scarce things, like you go to gold, which increases in supply at roughly 1.5 or 2% per year, that's kind of taking away some of the price edge that it would otherwise have. Same thing for like a typical home, not like a super scarce waterfront property, but a typical home. That's a relatively energy intensive, labor intensive thing. And so that's generally increasing at a pretty rapid pace. So for that kind of category of things like beef or oil or houses or gold, you'll generally be increasing slightly slower than the money supply on average, but above the rate of CPI. And then when you look at the long tail of things that we've gotten way more productive at, either because we've industrialized them, we manufacture them, or we've digitized them, or we've outsourced them, automated them, things we've gotten way better at are outright deflationary, and so they bring down the average of CPI. Whereas if you were going after, kind of the classic like American dream, right? So single family housing, good healthcare, good nutritious food. That basket is generally going to be going up at a higher pace than CPI, and it'll be going up at a somewhat slower pace than money supply growth, in part because we're getting slightly more productive at making the various components that go into that basket.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about all the variables that go into it, because it's often, we're tasked to, I guess, one of the claims to your fame is how you take all these complex issues and put them into concrete terms and phrases that allow us to understand the world a little bit better. But we also have an oversimplification on our end with just a number, and so it's hard for people to kind of interpret it. And there's a constant, almost Rorschach-like test when people look at the numbers we put up, and it's fascinating to think about all the different variables. But you are listening to Truflation Spaces. It's a special edition with Lyn Alden. Her new book, Broken Money: Why Our Financial System is Failing Us and How We Can Make It Better, is available right now. So go ahead and get it. Stefan, you had a question?
Yeah, no, Lyn, just I appreciate the comments, right? But one of the things, right, if you look at broken money versus the financial system is failing, is it not the money that's not broken? It's actually the financial system. You mentioned earlier the speed at which information can flow. I mean, Credit Suisse was that they blamed social media for their downfall, right? And their inability to move and provide liquid capital as fast as they needed it in this day and age where everybody's on mobile phones. So FUD can spread super fast. And as a result, the demand and processes need to continuously be stress tested to meet the speed of withdrawals or the speed of market requirements that is now fully mobile, as you mentioned, right? So the system, and the fact that we have so much debt is because we have politicians that are using the money printer to actually, in essence, what they're doing is buying votes, right? And so is it not the system that is actually really broken, less the money itself, right? And the currency that we're trying to use, it's the system that's broken. And how do you see that fixing itself? Is Bitcoin's going to be the answer? Is it going to be hyper Bitcoinization that's going to bring everything down and going to force a change? Is it going to be a revolution? Because there's no way Wall Street or the central banks or the G20 is going to give up the power that they have at the moment easily, right? They're going to fight tooth and nail to hold on to the existing system because that's what they know. And as long as people are happy with selecting the color of the new paper money that's going to be printed from a pre-filtered selection, it's like the system's just broken. And how do we fix that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the way I think about it is that the bounds of technology is what kind of dictates what the failure modes of money are going to be, or what the limitations are on policymakers. And so, for example, if you had a hypothetical world where people could just teleport gold to each other, and it had no portability restrictions, no divisibility restrictions, it would be very hard, if not impossible, for policymakers to say, no, don't do that. Use these slips of paper we control instead for money. Or use our own kind of proprietary centralized accounting system, we call it the dollar. It'd be very hard to impose that on a world where people could just teleport gold to each other, and they always could. And instead, the reason that this system was able to develop the way it did was because gold had that inherent limitation that became increasingly apparent in the post-telegraph world. And so it required all of this abstraction in order to kind of keep up with this, new digital world that existed. And over time, that allowed for, the infrequency that people wanted to take out gold, the infrequency that it was moved around and transported, led to very, very high ratios of claims for gold than actual gold. So one example I give in the book is I reference an 1875 book by William Stanley Jevons, And he talked about how in the UK at the time, you had something like a 20-to-1 ratio of claims for base money. And on one hand, he was praising how efficient it all had become, because with so much netting and centralized clearing, you barely needed to move gold around anymore. On the other hand, he's like, we can't forget that like all of these claims are claims for gold, and if we don't handle that system well, that can all collapse and default and cause all sorts of problems, which of course it did once they ran into World War I a few decades later. And so the limitations of gold itself is what allowed this kind of current system to exist for the better part of a century in various increasing ways. And when that happens, basically when those claims start to collapse relative to the monetary base, the difference was it became popular enough for them to instead increase the monetary base, kind of decouple from gold, depeg from gold, eventually entirely. And they're having the system that there's, gold on its own is not fast enough to keep up with. It's useful as a savings asset, but it's not really useful as like a alternative monetary or financial system. And so I think the answer to your question is that the only thing that even has a shot of displacing this current system is something like Bitcoin. It's not a guarantee that it will, but basically I view it as kind of the first credible tool where people can actually build like a parallel financial system, a parallel money, a parallel kind of circular economy, because you have something that's both scarce and that it moves around as fast or faster than fiat currency. And so I think the only way, like the only kind of potential path to kind of choke out this current system is for just over time, more and more monetary energy moves away from this system, moves into that other system until the other system breaks. And I think that's one of those things. It's not something that happens in a couple of years or a couple of months. That's more of, if it's going to happen at all, that's kind of a generational type of switchover.
So you don't see sort of a gradual and then suddenly approach where all of a sudden we're going to be immersed in this new alternative money, right? Because if you look back at the 70s, we had we had inflation, we had super high interest rates, and if you make analogies to an age where we didn't even have computers, but but you still sort of look at that period, you saw super high oil prices and people flooded towards safe havens, and that was gold. Right? Are we going to see sort of something similar where all of a sudden people are going to lose total faith in the existing system and then flee to, Bitcoin? And you can already see all the big, large institutions building out huge portfolios and reserves in Bitcoin, all sort of, stealth mode without, but still bad mouthing crypto. And, retail users can't get crypto. They have to go through the financial institutions when they're ready to buy their ETFs. So I'm just sort of keen to, or intrigued to see, will this be sort of a gradually then suddenly morph, or it's going to be over decades, like you mentioned?
I think both can be true. I think it can take a very long time, but then also accelerate at certain points. So you can have kind of periods of rapid switchover. And I think a couple things that you can kind of look at that would define those moments are, I think a lot of it's centered around the dollar itself, because what we see currently is when a country has like a failing currency, let's say it's Argentina or Lebanon, for example, generally what will happen is people will gravitate towards the dollar. So that could take the form of physical dollars, that could take the form of stable coins. Some countries outright dollarize, but a lot of people basically what they do is they switch over to using the dollar as their intermediate term savings wherever possible. And of course, then the question is, what happens if the dollar itself one day has like a kind of a vicious inflationary spiral? That's where I think you could get a more suddenly type of scenario. And then so the question becomes, what is the probability or time frame where that might happen? And I think that's still an open question, but the one thing to keep looking at, I think, is the accumulation of public debt, because as I've written about in some of my recent newsletters or articles, it's not as though the dollar itself is a stable system. It's instead a system that gradually becomes more and more unstable over time because it relies on that constant debt increase. So basically, we've had multiple decades of debt accumulation. That started to all break in 2008. So a lot of that debt was basically transferred to the public level. And now we have a situation where the public debt keeps increasing. And back in the 70s, they were able to raise rates super high, and that was able to slow down inflation because most of the money creation was from private sector bank lending, not from the government. And the overall government debt to GDP ratio was like 30%. And so raising rates put a lot more downward pressure on the private sector than it did put pressure on the government itself. But when you get to a situation where it's reversed and the government has over 100% debt to GDP, interest rates become a somewhat less effective tool for controlling inflation because they end up increasing the interest expense, increasing the deficit, which is ironically a type of stimulus. So you have kind of these two competing market forces. So on one hand, higher interest rates are putting downward pressure on commercial real estate, on any company that relies on bank loans, anything with short duration debt like junk rated companies, for example. But then it's not really putting too much pressure on homeowners. It's not putting too much pressure on investment grade corporations, right? It's just putting these kind of localized downward pressure. But then on the other hand, it's paying out very large amounts of money on the interest expense to banks, to the foreign sector, to wealthy individuals. And so it's kind of, in other ways, a type of stimulus. And over time, over years and decades, as you get higher and higher public debt to GDP ratios, I think we can hit a point where the market loses confidence in the central bank's ability to kind of keep that money supply growth at a moderate pace. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's kind of the long-term end game, like the end game scenario to consider for where things might accelerate.
You are listening to Truflation Spaces with special guest Lyn Alden. She's got a new book out called Broken Money. Go get it. Well worth seeking out. We do want your questions and comments. And it looks like we've got a bunch, so I'm going to start getting people in here. It looks like the first is from Fiat Fire. So I'm going to put you up here. Go right ahead, Fiat Fire. You have a question or comment for Lyn Alden? Fiat Fire, are you there? Hello. Okay. We'll move then to Zach of All Trades. Hey, Zach, you have a question or comment for Lyn Alden?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. So my question is actually a two-part question. One is regarding where we are being in a state of disinflation, based on how the last few months have been looking, and heading toward a potential deflation. What are some of the sectors that you see that have the smallest debt burdens, or the best debt to equity ratios as a whole that you are eyeballing? And I'll start with that question and ask the next question after.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you look at past inflations, most of them came in waves because the central bank doesn't just sit there and kind of do nothing and let it happen. They do try to fight back for periods of time. To use an extreme example, even in the Weimar hyperinflation, there were some serious attempts by the central bank to stop that process from happening. So you'd have like these sharp periods of strengthening of the currency before they would have the next wave of inflation. And of course, that happens. The fact that happens even in hyperinflation shows how central banks do try to fight back during any sort of normal course of inflation. And so right now we have disinflation in a number of categories. We have a sharp slowdown in the supply of money growth. So for a period of time, you had outright contraction of money supply. Ever since spring of this year, shortly after the banking crisis, we've instead had roughly flat broad money supply. And so that's a rather disinflationary force. The part I'm looking at for more sticky inflation is energy. I think that basically the supply and demand characteristics of the energy market are one of the kind of the higher probability vectors for how we could get a second wave of inflation. And I think another kind of just process to look at is similar to the 2019 repo spike, or similar to the early 2023 banking crisis. The Fed can run into instances where it kind of loses control of its own balance sheet. Like it's no longer able to keep shrinking its balance sheet as it expected to. And so once we get to a point where the reverse repo facility is used up, and if we keep having this very large ongoing treasury issuance, you could get to a point where the Fed is unable to tighten in the way that they prefer, even if you still have above target inflation from energy or from other parts of the economy. So I think we're seeing disinflation in a number of categories, probably sticky energy inflation for a period of time. And I think the next kind of larger wave comes when we have another period of cyclical growth and another period of liquidity from the central banks. Basically, right now, the fact that energy prices are where they are, even with a relatively low purchasing managers index, relatively low kind of industrial economic activity, rather low consumption out of China, the fact that energy is holding up this well, despite kind of central bank attempts to slow down their economies as much as possible to kind of tame inflation, the thing I would worry about is the next time we do have a period of accelerating growth again, all of these kind of inflationary forces still there, starting with, I think, energy being one of the key variables.
Very nice. Let's get some more questions in here. Bear, you are up. Gaius Julius Caesar the Fifth. Bear, can you hear us? Looks like you might have trouble connecting. So I will move on here. Let's see. Let's go with Dylan. You're up. Hey, Dylan, do you have a question for Lyn Alden? Hey, Dylan?
Yeah.
Do you have a question or comment for Lyn?
Yeah. I have a question. So we saw when she tweeted out about the triflation documentary, but just want to kind of get his thoughts on
Hey, Dylan, it's really hard to hear you, brother. Can you lean into the mic?
Is this better?
Okay, Lyn, did you get that?
Yes, I got it. Yes, I got it.
Okay.
So anyway, basically, I think that energy is probably one of the constructive energy themes for the next several years, because we've had a period of, historically it goes in cycles, right? There's like a very large capex boom, and then you get kind of a period of oversupply that kind of sends prices down, and then nobody wants to invest in the sector for a while, and then over time, incremental demand and using up some of those previously developed wells starts to kind of trigger a tighter supply situation that encourages more investment to come in. That can be somewhat hamstrung by policymakers kind of purposely trying to slow down investments in the energy space, kind of the ESG wave that's happening. So I think we could have kind of a worse energy cycle than normal, even though all kind of major periods of energy inflation are disruptive when they happen. And so I think that when you look at the overall kind of supply side of energy, speaking of specifically developed resources or things that are in the pipeline of being developed versus demand, the situation is pretty tight. It manifests right now in kind of Europe and in certain developing countries more readily. But because energy is roughly a global market, most types of energy are relatively fungible, to be transported around, with some exceptions like natural gas, which is a lot more kind of market specific due to the high cost of transporting it. But basically, I view that as kind of the most likely trigger for the next wave of inflation that I think is going to happen. And right now, we're seeing kind of energy prices creep back up. They're not really taking off. I think that makes sense given the relatively slow economic indicators that you see in many parts of the world. But basically, there's no kind of near-term pathway for bringing on a lot new supply. And so I think basically that is probably an attractive investment area for the next several years. But it's also not just an investment area, but it's like a social matter, something I think to be aware of for geopolitical reasons, or for just all sorts of just living your life, is that I do think that basically having access to secure energy is going to be one of the biggest risks in the years ahead.
Very nice.
Is that?
But
Yeah, I mean, sorry. We had Raoul Pal on a Spaces a while back, and one of the comments he said is the desire, the main reason why there is such a push for ESG or clean technology is to move away from to offload this geopolitical sensitivity associated with the price of oil and all of economy being dependent on oil and the source of oil and where it is. And so his argument was that over, I think he looked at it, I think over a period of, let's say, a century, that, or not even a century, maybe 10, 30 years or whatever it was, but the average price of a barrel was $40. And in essence, it always swayed, moved up and down around that rate. And that sort of defined how GDP could grow based on the cost basis. So you would tie to that. If we can make energy and we can create abundant energy using the natural resources and this push for ESG, and we can bring it down to $20 or $10 a unit for creating output. Is that sort of the big push behind ESG? And I don't know, my view is that's going to take us, we're there in maybe 20, 30 years. Or do you see the innovation happening in that area faster? And then thereby creating independence and thereby new growth can be generated off the back of that.
So generally speaking, superior technologies don't need assistance in terms of taking market share. So for example, when they invented digital cameras and eventually put digital cameras in phones, that proliferated naturally compared to previous photograph technologies. Because for 99% of people, it's just way better. And so it's a natural switchover. And so to the extent that other energy sources become more used, I think that's largely going to be a question of, are they good enough to compete on price? And right now, after years and years and years of investment, solar and wind, for example, are about 3% of global energy use production. And so it's been a relatively slow adoption cycle, and I think in large part that's because they're more expensive than they seem, especially when you talk about using them as kind of continuous power rather than just certain times of the day or certain times of the year. Because when you have solar, wind, and then you have electrical storage, that starts to get pretty expensive and materials heavy. And another factor is that right now, depending on what part of the solar manufacturing stack you look at, China controls 70 to 95% of it. So some of them, like the panels themselves, they control, I forget the number offhand, but it's like between 70 and 80%. And for certain parts, like converters and things like that, they have upwards of 90-some% market share, which is currently more concentrated than even all of OPEC for oil. So it's not clear that that's kind of a path out of that energy centralization that we've kind of experienced. I think in general, nuclear power is one of the highest likelihood areas for kind of rapid innovation. Basically, you see things like small modular reactors that can really bring down the cost. There's been safety improvements. It's already statistically very safe, even though the public is generally uneasy about it as a power source. But I think that's one of the kind of major areas that if it's kind of allowed to take off, I think could help lower the cost of energy. And I think that a catalyst for that might be if we do have a period of higher energy prices in our future. Let's say we go through a very rough kind of 5-year period of very high energy prices due to shortages of supply and things like that. That could be a catalyst for shifting into things like the next generation of nuclear.
Excellent. You are listening to Truflation Spaces. Do us a favor and get out to lynalden.com, LYNALDEN.com. All of her work is archived there, and pick up her new book, Broken Money. We're heading into the last 10 minutes or so. We've agreed to have her on for an hour, and so we've got to make sure we hold tight here. Going to try to get as many questions as we can in before we beg off. Let's see. Nixon, looks like you've been very patient. Nixon, do you have a question or comment for Lyn Alden? Perfect.
Letting me speak. Thank you, Lyn, for the time, and thank you, Stefan, for actually breaking the ice on Chainlink. That's sort of something I'd like to get Lyn to say more than 5 words about. But the book, Broken Money, I'm about 100 pages in, just to get to this sort of trend of money and technology. It seems like over time, we're abstracting away from commodities and increasing the speed of transactions, but also counterparty risk. So more broadly, not so specific to just Chainlink, the technology, but the idea of crypto economic security, that is using economic incentives and cryptographic protocols for securing and reducing counterparty risk. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it depends on the area of application. Generally, what we've seen over the past, call it decade of crypto, uses outside of money have generally struggled to take off. So basically, Bitcoin's reached a very large market capitalization. Stable coins also have reached a very large size, both in terms of market capitalization and the volumes that they're used at, and kind of widespread adoption, and especially in certain parts of the developing world. Other use cases have thus far been, they have kind of a period of time where they're exciting, but then that sort of dies down. I think an important question to consider going forward is that, decentralization does have a cost associated with it, often a very high cost if you want to be as decentralized as possible. And so I think it comes a matter of determining what industries high levels of decentralization make sense. For a lot of things, we're happy to centralize it as long as it's either not critical or as long as we can switch over should we need to. And a lot of people don't really seek out decentralization unless there's a specific problem that they're trying to solve with centralized systems. So I think that overall, like, it's a useful area to research. I think that, basically cryptography can apply to more things than just money. But in general, it's just been a very hyped up industry where a lot of people kind of argue that everything's going to be decentralized, everything's going to be cryptographic. Whereas I still think there's going to be a long-term role for a lot of things being relatively centralized, and around the margins, we can figure out what things are actually best to decentralize, and what things can be solved with cryptography, which I think is bigger than just money, but I don't think it's, my personal view is it's not as big as what some of the kind of the broad crypto proponents would argue.
Let's see. Let's bring in Saffron. You've been very patient. Saffron, we are connecting. What's your question or comment for Lyn Alden?
Oh, wow. Super happy and thankful to be up here. Big fan of Lyn. Let's see if I can manage to speak. So I've been looking at the psychology part of money and the effect of whether your money is in your checking account, within equity in your real estate, or equity in equities. And it's a little bit of a Schrodinger's cat situation. The money's there hypothetically, but it does affect how people go out and spend their money. Do you think that people not being used to inflation and how much their equities and everything else have gone up contributes to maybe like a higher R star? And then on a secondary part of that, I struggle with hanging out in like second order consequences a lot. And I'm wondering, with all the noise and everything going on out in the world, if there was like one first order consequence that you would mainly focus in on, what would that be?
So there have been studies that show that the ease of spending money influences how much we spend on average. So, for example, it's generally easier to spend with a credit card than pulling out cash and collecting change. When we spend cash, we're more psychologically attached to the process. We're more kind of aware that we're spending money. Whereas when we spend with a card, that abstraction kind of lowers our inhibitions a little bit, and we're more likely to spend more. So those are certainly things that can impact things. Basically, the technology of money itself, the ease of use, can ironically have a little bit of a downside in that regard. I don't think that's going to slow down the adoption of more efficient types of money, but it is kind of just a consequence that can happen. maybe be different if the money itself was appreciating rather than depreciating. But it's also, I think, that the friction itself is a big deal. As it pertains to kind of the R star and just the overall recent increase in asset prices, again, it goes back to the fact that there's different types of inflation, which is hard for people to wrap their head around. So if you have a structural kind of 40% increase in the money supply over a period of time, that does start to trickle into permanently higher prices and a number of other things. So it might not translate into higher software prices because there's really no supply scarcity there, but it is going to transmit into higher real estate prices, higher prices of the well-performing company equity, things like that. Basically, a lot of things get kind of permanently reset upward when you have a permanent increase in the money supply, and that's still taking a while to work itself out. I mean, and as I talked about before, the higher interest rates in such an indebted system, although they do push down prices in some ways, like they put a lot of pressure on highly leveraged entities that have to refinance their debt in a relatively short period of time. But they're actually stimulatory for other people. Like if you're a retiree and you hold large amounts of cash in money markets and bonds, you're getting paid higher rates now than you were a couple years ago. You're actually generating more income. There are even corporations out there where they might have, say, 10 billion in cash equivalents and they have 10 billion in debt. The debt is low fixed rate, long duration because they're investment grade companies that lock that in, and yet their cash is short duration and adjusting. And so as the Fed raises rates, they actually get higher income over time because they've locked in their liabilities and their assets are paying a higher rate. So ironically, as the Fed raises rates, it's both depressing for certain entities, but it's actually stimulating for other types of entities. And so that's where you can get potentially a higher R star. And I'm not sure I understood the second part of the question.
All right. I'm going to sneak in one last question here from listeners, and that would be Bradley Ryan. Hey, Bradley, question, comment for Lyn Alden.
Hey, thank you. Surprised me. Yeah, I came late, so if I'm asking a question that's out of the stream or was asked already, I apologize. But there's a lot of noise from folks like Peter Zion lately on just how big the overbuild is in China and what the potential impacts of that might be if there's a collapse washing over the global financial system. And that maybe is too big a question to ask, but I'll throw it out there. And my question really is, what do you foresee as the near-term sort of biggest danger to the global financial system? Is it China? Thanks.
Great question.
Yeah, good question. I've generally had a kind of a moderate view on China, which is to say that I've never really been as bullish as the people arguing that China is going to take everything over. China is like this big like rising powerhouse. On the other hand, I've not been as bearish as like the Zihans of the world saying that that they're going to have this big demographics collapse and it's like this gigantic malinvestment that's all going to implode. I've had kind of a middle view in the sense that they do face a demographics cliff. They do have a lot of real estate debt malinvestment, so that can certainly slow things down a lot. I think one of the kind of the risks facing China, the more realistic risk, is kind of Japanification, where they go through a kind of a long period of stagnation that is partially tied to demographics and partially tied to debt deleveraging. Now, of course, there are tail risks that could cause a problem related to kind of the aforementioned discussions around energy security, things like that. So obviously, China takes its energy security pretty heavily, pretty seriously. I mean, but outside of certain tail risks manifesting, I view China as kind of on a path towards Japan in that sense, where it'll reach some sort of percentage of global GDP and then slow down significantly. And I think that's kind of the process that we're starting to see unfold. For the second part of the question, what do I view as the biggest risk? I would probably say energy security. I think that if you have a spike in energy prices at a time when the Federal Reserve is also trying to tighten up the dollar, that's really damaging to a lot of developing countries because they have dollar-denominated debt and they, in many cases, have to import energy. And so that could be a really painful squeeze for billions of people in the world. And so I when I kind of list things that could go really, really, really wrong, energy security, especially in this kind of current environment, is pretty high up on my list.
Wow. We have definitely put you through the paces. That is a full hour of Lyn Alden, who basically put on a clinic here. We do appreciate it. Get out to lynalden.com, LYNALDEN.com. A new book, Broken Money, is well worth the price. It's actually moderately priced when you consider the thing's a brick. Before I let you go, very selfish. Are you going to do an audio version of that book? Because we keep getting that question.
Yeah, I have an audio version that's currently in the works. I expect it to be available by the end of October. So yeah, I have seen a lot of requests on that, and it is in process.
Boom. Cannot thank you enough for doing this. And one last editorial comment here. We've had a lot of heavy hitters on Truflation Spaces, like some big names. I have never seen so much engagement, so many requests to ask questions, and so much excitement. So you're a hit, kid. So glad that you came on. We will have and return to our normally scheduled program here in October, where we do our CPI analysis, and we also comment on the Federal Open Market Committee. That's all in October. We will see you then, gang. Again, for now, get out to lynalden.com. Make sure you pick up the book. And thanks again, Lyn, so much for coming on.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to listen. I'm always humbled by the turnout, and so have fun with the rest of your day.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in October. Bye for now.